Silicon Valley has this fantasy around it with startups and tech. You think of Apple or Google. You think of entrepreneurs like Mark Zuckerberg or Steve Jobs. Many ambitious, young, talented people flock to San Francisco and Silicon Valley in hopes to make it big in the startup world. Silicon Valley is the Hollywood of startups. When you hear Tampa Bay, you think of maybe their sports teams or that it's close to the beach. Tampa Bay doesn't ring opportunity or where people go to start their careers.
Everything that you've said about the region is totally correct. I mean, people don't look at Florida and say, Florida is exactly where you're going to go start a technology startup. And Tampa Bay definitely does not get the airtime that it could because within Florida, there's a lot of major cities, the biggest of which being Miami. So it's really important that we figure out how to start to build a brand for this region.
Lakshmi Shenoy is trying to change this around by creating Tampa Bay to be the next Silicon Valley of the Southeast. You are listening to How to Build an Audience, the podcast that tells the stories of how some of the top entrepreneurs, marketers, and communicators built a following around their businesses and brands. I am your host, Matthew Katosi. Today I'm talking with Lakshmi Shenoy. On paper, Lakshmi's resume will blow you away. With an undergrad from U Chicago and an MBA from Harvard Business School, she has worked with major companies as a business management consultant. She then went on to work with startups in Chicago at the largest startup incubator, 1871. Lakshmi moved to Tampa Bay in 2018 to start Embark Collective, where she is the CEO and is helping to create a space and program to help startups thrive in Tampa Bay. Lakshmi is nothing short of impressive, but her love for startups wasn't always there. It took some time to find her identity before she invested in supporting young companies and founders.
The first part of my career was really spent working on really big brands, which was awesome. It gives you sort of the boot camp on how to work with really large enterprises and quite frankly how to build a company for scale. But as I had that moment in my career where I was thinking, what am I doing with my life, and is this really the impact that I want to make? It allowed me to really take another look at where did I want to be spending my time. And what's interesting about my life is I've always been somebody who's built a lot of things. And it's been a lot of times I didn't even realize it. I just, whether it's new, I think back to childhood and it's new clubs, or my friends and I would go around the neighborhood and we raise money for saving the rainforest. And then we built a little magazine that we gave to everybody who donated to us. And just these little entrepreneurial efforts. And I realized that at my core, I'm a builder. I'm somebody who loves to take an idea, come up with an idea, and just start working on it. And once I had that realization, it took me a while to have that realization of this is where my passion is. But I was in business school when I had that realization, and it happened to coincide with the '08 recession, which is actually a really good time to think about starting a new business. So started to get a flavor and started to test out some new ideas then, and then come around to 2014, that's when I really had my, I don't want to call it midlife crisis because I hope I have a very long life, but let's call it a mid-career crisis of what am I doing? What's my meaning? And I realized that I really wanted to place myself at the start of new ventures. And because of my experience around really understanding how to scale an organization, I could add value to entrepreneurs. And so that's where I made the change from working for some of the largest corporations, whether it was directly like Procter and Gamble and Time Inc., or doing it from a consulting standpoint when I was in management consulting, or when I was at an ad agency, all of which were giant, giant brands. And that just didn't get me excited in the morning to get up and go to work. So, looked for this other pivot, and that's exactly how I made the shift into the startup universe, which has been amazing, and I have not looked back since.
Now, you did say something interesting, that it's a great time to start a business in a recession. And a lot of people are saying that COVID-19 this time is about to go into a major recession if we have not already been in it in some ways, even if the stock market is going up and up and up. Why is it the best time to start a business or an idea at what would seem the worst time economically to do that?
So I'll answer it in two ways. First of all, I'll take the coronavirus as the example. Um, this crisis has brought about, if you're an entrepreneur and you're solving a really big problem for the world, sometimes you need to figure out, what is that problem I'm going to solve? And there's no way to avoid all of the potential problems to solve with the coronavirus. It is a health crisis. It is a socioeconomic crisis. We're having job crisis. We're having every type of parental care, whether it's caring for elders or caring for children. There's a crisis. So as I think about what are the big ambitious problems to solve for the world, there's just seeds everywhere of things that entrepreneurs could go after and fix for the world. This crisis has brought all of these existing issues just to the forefront. It wasn't like they didn't exist before. They just were existing in a very fragile way, and it took this crisis to really reinforce how fragile they are and that they need fixing. So that's one part of it. The other part I would say is, when you're an entrepreneur, you're starting out with very limited resources, both in time and money. And this crisis just reinforces the fact that you're going to start out with it being really, really hard. And that's just the nature of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is not easy. And so it's as good a time as any to start a company. And in some ways, I think about the fact that if you as an entrepreneur can make it through this crisis, you're going to have the resiliency to be able to make it through any future crisis. So you might as well start when it's really, really hard, just to prove to yourself that you can do it. So that's my perspective. I'm sure there's lots of people that would disagree with me, but you can't be in this universe without finding optimism and like an opportunity in the times that feel the most dire.
When you get to the core of any business, it should try to serve a group of people and solve their problems that are specific to them. But as we start a business, we can start to fantasize about what we are building versus actually getting the product or service in front of the customer. Lakshmi has been able to see a lot of startups succeed and fail in her career. I wanted to know the biggest mistakes that startups have made in her experience.
When you're an early stage company, and those are the companies that Embark Collective works with, is folks that are just starting out, and they may have an initial version of their product, but it's not, it doesn't have all of the bells and whistles, and they're still very much figuring it out. And so at that point, the term is product market fit. You really want to figure out, is what you're building, is there an audience that will pay for what you are building? And the big challenge with product market fit is assuming that you know the market, assuming that you understand the ins and outs and the pain points of your audience, and the messaging that's going to resonate with them, and the value proposition that's going to resonate with them. And oftentimes companies will stumble into this pitfall of believing they understand their audience through and throughout, because they are they're part of their audience. They're somebody who has experienced the problem that they are trying to solve for. So then you go about thinking that your experience is representative of your entire target market's experience, and that's just probably not the case. If you're coming in with that assumption, it's probably not the case. So I think the big challenge is, how do you take a step back and how do you start to test your hypotheses around who your audience is and what is the problem they need you to solve. And there's a really excellent book. My team knows that I reference this book probably twice a day, and it's called The Mom Test. And it just does a really great job of giving very tactical guidelines on how do you start to get user input without biasing the person who's being asked the questions. It's very easy for somebody to say, like, I have a water bottle in front of me, and if I pointed at it and said, "You love this water bottle, right?" they are being led to say right, because that's the easy answer. It's in versus really asking questions about, do you even have a need to have a vessel to carry a liquid? Like, if so, does it have to look like, there's a much more sophisticated chain of questioning that can get you to true insights that can actually help your product be successful out in the market. So that, to me, is always the assumption that your audience. That's like a giant warning sign for me, that we've got some work to do.
I want to go practical with you. What does that actually look like? How do companies do that? How does a small business do that? How do you actually go about figuring out what is the true problem versus what we perceive as the problem?
There are some playbooks and the Mom Test is definitely a good example of one playbook, but it's not the only way to be able to get user feedback. And so I would say that making sure that you are reaching the entire a good representation of the audience that you're trying to reach. And so making sure that the people that you are getting input from, that's not a 1 degree of separation from you. You're starting to talk to strangers who you've never met before. And maybe you don't have to, especially in the time of Corona, I'm not asking you to like sit at a coffee shop and meet somebody, but everybody has, if you can get to somebody who's 2 degrees away or 3 degrees away by using your network, everyone has some network that they have associated with them. And one would assume that their network knows somebody that you don't know. And so starting to leverage that to get to an audience that you have not reached before, I think, is a really smart thing to do. And as you do these interviews, I'll call them customer interviews or potential customer interviews or audience interviews, you'll start to realize that there's some themes in what you're hearing. And so at a certain point, you've realized you've captured 90% of the information and the feedback that you're going to get, and there's diminishing returns, and you'll know when you hit that mark, and you can start to wind back the effort. But I even think about anecdotally to when I moved down here to Tampa to launch what is now Embark Collective. This is the exact exercise I had to go through. Even though I wasn't launching a tech startup, I needed to truly understand who was my potential audience. And without leading the audience in what I was building, I needed to understand, like, what were the barriers they had in building a startup in Tampa. And that was a lot of listening. And I had I joke about how I had like 500 conversations over coffee. And for several months, that was all I did. I just sat there and listened to people. But it gave me a good understanding of not only validating or proving wrong my ingoing hypotheses, but also showing me other avenues that we could solve how we could solve the problem that I never even thought about. And I'll stop my rant after this point, but I really believe that you have to, as a founder, as an early stage founder, you really have to stay focused on what is the problem you want to be solving, and don't get so fixated on the way that you're solving it. All of us who are building early stage solutions, the way that solution looks today versus a month from now is totally different. We're continuing to iterate. The vision of the product is not fixed, but the problem that we're solving, that looms over us. It's something we cannot stop thinking about, and we want to be able to really spend the time to thoughtfully find out how to solve it today, but also create space for us to evolve the solution to be able to solve for the future. If you look at any tech product, it's a great proof of that. Version 1 versus version 20,
Yep.
it's totally different, and they all go to market. But you learn about the customer, you learn about their pain points, and you solve accordingly.
So obviously, if you question well, you'll do well. But a lot of people don't do that. And that's really where the failures are. Outside of questioning well, what do successful startups do that can really take an idea to a product to an audience that will actually pay successfly?
Oh my gosh, that's like the secret sauce.
Yeah, I need the secrets.
Most companies will unfortunately it's that's the challenge of it all. And so we do the best we can, and there's a process for how do you it's a scientific process. I mean, it's so similar to anybody doing an experiment. I just think back to like fifth grade when we learned the scientific method of having a hypothesis, doing an experiment, like doing the analysis, understanding whether or not the results reinforce the hypothesis or not. That's the exact way that you're building a startup, is starting with your hypothesis, testing it, doing the analysis, and going through that process over and over again until you're able to validate hypotheses about both what the problem is, who is suffering from that problem, and how you can solve it.
A major aspect of most startups is venture capital. It is not easy to get money from people. Founders will go hundreds of meetings and pitches without getting a single dollar. Lakshmi is on a mission to help startups thrive, and part of that is getting funding. I want to know how much storytelling is involved to successfully obtain funding.
The communication and the storytelling is in some ways all you have at the very, very early stage. There's companies that are going out for venture funding pretty early on. They may have a prototype of a product. They may have some proof that there is an audience that will pay for what they are building. But aside from that, they have their team, they have their vision, they may have a brand associated with their company. And so that idea of storytelling, which to me is building the brand, and then you as a team, that is what the investor and the brand also really communicates what that bigger vision is for the company. That's what the investor is investing in. So I think that is a huge, huge piece of the early stage venture process, before you really have the demonstrable traction to show that you're truly onto something.
You've talked about like this scientific method analysis, and I think a main thing that you really talk about here is just researching and listening. Is there a place for this? How do you actually get good at communicating? How do you practice that? How do you get better at pitching? What are some of the mechanics or ways people can get better at actually reaching the audience? They know that there's an audience, but now it's not just like, hey, you're my audience, but it's really like, how do they tell that story that really converts people into action versus just letting them know that they have that issue and that there may be a solution?
I mean, I think you hit it on the head when you said practice. No one is going to be able to tell the story of their brand, the first time they try and really nail it. You have to continue to tell the story, and you have to get feedback on how's the story resonating. And oftentimes I'll ask directly for feedback. Anytime I am speaking about Embark Collective, I'll ask my team, what worked, what didn't, what messages really hit with that audience, what didn't, because we're continually evolving how we tell our story. And so I think just looking for as many at bats as you can get, if it's sharing your story, and I tend to move away from the term pitching, because I really do think that it's storytelling. It's not. It should be much more organic. You should be able to tell your story, whether it's on stage or in a meeting or at a coffee shop or in an elevator, wherever it might be. You've got to be able to share that story, and so finding those opportunities, being okay when it doesn't work out, because and working to get as much practice as you can, so then when you hit those really high stakes moments, you're coming in with the confidence that A, you know how to tell your story, B, you've learned so much from hearing other people's feedback and even just watching reactions to how you tell your story, and see, hopefully at some point you might have even like recorded it or heard yourself, and you can start to give yourself a self-critique on, I liked how I did this, I want to improve on that. But Embark Collective, one of our values as an organization is inspire iteration, and it's just to show that this idea of feedback and iterating is a positive thing. This actually signals progress versus a step back. It's actually, when you get feedback, you're moving forward versus moving backwards. So trying to practice as much as you can, as you said, and getting input on, how are those practices going.
Lakshmi is not only helping other startups thrive, but she herself is building Embark Collective and trying to put Tampa Bay on the map for business. After the break, Lakshmi tells us how she ended up in Tampa Bay and how she's building the next Silicon Valley. This show is created by Gatozi Collective. Beyond our weekly podcast, we have a weekly newsletter that comes out every Thursday called The Marketing Memo. We have some marketing tips to help you build your audience, and we curate amazing examples of great content that other brands are producing. It is free, and you can sign up on our website that is linked in our show notes. Now, let's get back to the show. When you think startups and tech, you think Silicon Valley. Beyond that, you think of major cities like New York or Chicago. But Tampa? That seems like an odd place to want to start a movement. But Lakshmi is putting roots down and looking to build something special.
What's interesting is that before coming to Tampa, I had no connection to the city of Tampa, to the region of Tampa Bay, to the state of Florida. I have only lived in large cities. I'm from Chicago. I lived in New York, Boston, spent a lot of time in the Bay Area, but moving to Florida was not in my plan. And it just came through a moment of opportunity, where I had the opportunity to meet somebody named Jeff Finnick, who is the owner of the NHL team, the Tampa Bay Lightning, amongst many, many other accolades. And he's really invested in this community in Tampa Bay. Tampa being Tampa, St. Pete, Clearwater, that entire region makes up Tampa Bay. And he was realizing that this region was not attracting the quality of talent that it could, because it didn't have, it wasn't known for being the place for really innovative talent to come to. So he looked around the country looking at what are some different models for really attracting innovative talent, and that brought him to Chicago, where I was, and he came to visit the organization that I used to work at called 1871, which is the largest startup hub in the country, supporting when I was there, supporting 500 early stage companies. And 1871 is named for the year of the Chicago fire. So just to clarify, what does that even mean? And it's a really wonderful organization. And we met there, and he reached out several, it might have been even a year and a half later after we met, and said, hey, would you ever be interested in trying to build a model like what you came from, but you could sort of have decide the vision of what it would be, and do it down here in Tampa. And you just don't get opportunities like that. You don't get opportunities to be able to take what you've learned and build something from scratch, especially when you're a builder like I've shared that I am. It was one of those moments where I was like, there's so much that I don't know about what could happen, but there's too much possibility to say no. So that's how I ended up here in 2018. But I think everything that you've said about the region is totally correct. I mean, people don't look at Florida and say, Florida is exactly where you're going to go start a technology startup. And Tampa Bay definitely does not get the airtime that it could, because within Florida, there's a lot of major cities, the biggest of which being Miami. So it's really important that we figure out how to start to build a brand for this region. And that's how Embark Collective all came to be, was, can we build a brand that starts to put this region on the map nationally and demonstrate that this is a really great place to build a startup? And some of it, the foundation had already been laid, but some of it we had to build, because there were plenty of opportunities. It wasn't like everything was perfect and you just needed to broadcast what was happening. We needed to really invest to make sure that the resources that were available here were competitive with any market out there. So lots and lots of work. And we created the physical space so that when you're here, you know where to go to find those like-minded tech-focused people. And we're still in the beginning stretches of it all, but so far it's been pretty fun to see it all start to come to fruition.
There's an interesting thing because a lot of times I'm interviewing people and it's really about building an audience kind of online, kind of like even with businesses. Yes, it is online and it's offline, but very rarely do they have physical spaces. And so I'm curious, it sounds like part of Embark Collective was actually to have a space where people could go, where people could recognize the brand. So how important is that physical space for building your audience and really honestly just pushing your mission out in Tampa Bay and beyond?
Having the physical space is really a critical part of making sure that the offering here is tangible. And what I mean by that is, by creating a physical central landing zone, the startups that are here can find each other. Building a startup is so lonely, and community is so critical to being able to survive the ups and downs of it all. So very, very important to make it easy for startups to be able to find each other. But then as you think about talent that is considering Tampa Bay, which is a really interesting thing to watch, this region is hugely high growth, and I didn't realize the extent of the growth here until I came down here. But anecdotally, at least 3 times a week, I'll have a conversation with somebody who is thinking about moving to this region from somewhere else. And that to me is amazing. I don't know if there's other regions that are generating that level of initial interest. And so when those visitors, or when those prospective Tampanians are ready to come down here, being able to come to a space like this, which is 32,000 square feet of space in downtown Tampa, and see like-minded, smart people who are building really ambitious companies, all of a sudden you're like, I found my people, I belong here. And it creates this visual density that is really needed to show that you're not the only one taking the leap. People have already taken the leap, and you've got your built-in community here. And it's really important because I mentioned that Tampa Bay is, not just Tampa, it's also St. Petersburg and Clearwater, and you could even define it more broadly, but it's a spread out place. And so when we can consolidate that and create one centralized place for this community, it creates what we think of as visual density. And there's so much power in having visual density and making the sale of, you're not alone, you're not the only early adopter here. If you come down here, you have a community that will take care of you.
Part of Embark Collective's ethos is events. They have this beautiful space that is not just for co-working, but a place to gather and collaborate on ideas and the future. I want to know how events allow Embark Collective to build their audience in Tampa and beyond.
Yeah, and I think you've nailed it in terms of, we're a new organization. I moved down here in 2018. We got started in earnest supporting 25 companies in 2019, but we did that while we were building out the physical space. So the physical space was actually ready in January of 2020, and then we closed the space temporarily because of COVID in March of 2020, and we just reopened it in June of this year. So but we are not hosting events right now, public events, just because um, of coronavirus. I don't need to say more.
Yeah.
And what I'll say is that I'll give you more of the vision, but I'll be very honest with you that we've barely had a chance to get started in terms of the vision. But the Embark Collective is an education nonprofit, and our scope of sort of domain is really around entrepreneurship, innovation, technology, and business. And we have a team who is really supportive of the companies that we work with intensive coaching and programming. And that's our core audience. That's the audience that we spend during coronavirus, we spend 100% of our time focused on, but even before it, at least 90% of our efforts were spent on our core audience of the early stage startups that are members of Embark Collective. But we do have this opportunity to connect with the community at large. And the reason we want to connect with the community at large is because they represent future founders. They represent a talent pipeline to join these startups. They represent customers and investors. And so they're really important to engage. And we have done some events even prior to having space where we really focused on connecting our core audience with some national names. We brought in 40 or so national early stage investors to meet the companies and do a day-long investor summit. Last year, we did this amazing founder summit for the member companies that are a part of Embark Collective, bringing in some amazing founders from around the country who had been through the early stage process and really were able to provide some tactical learnings for the startups that we work with. But we have just gotten started on engaging the audience that's the non member audience for us. And so as we think about what does it look like once we're able to start hosting events again, I really want to make sure that living up to our education nonprofit structure, making sure that we are teaching people technology skills. We're teaching them to code. We're teaching them about new technologies so that people don't feel like they have to be left behind, because they have no exposure to new technologies. I want to make sure that we are able to connect corporations to innovation practices. That's something that I focused a lot on in Chicago. And there are so many learnings that large enterprises can learn from sort of the ways of early stage startups, and how do you start to share that with the corporations that are based here, and making sure that we're engaging that investor audience, and that of course is going to be really important for startups that are reliant on that external capital to scale.
You obviously have been in many different cities, like you said, worked with a lot of different companies, and even been in some of these kind of like accelerator programs. So you've worked with and consulted with a lot of companies. So your network is pretty big. How is your personal brand, your personal network, how has it helped you build an audience in Tampa and kind of bring all these connections that you have around the country, the world, into this undiscovered Tampa Bay area, but then also really how's that helped you build Embark Collective?
And I'll caveat this by saying that you could take how I'm responding for not only me, but every member of my team. Every member of my team leverages all dimensions of their network. And we have team members who are not from Tampa, and they're here for some reason, and they've been recruited onto our team. I have another team member who is from this area, but we were able to recruit her down from New York to move back here so that she could really make an impact on her hometown. And all of us really leverage our broader non-Tampa network to be able to better the startups that we work with. And that requires a couple of things. It requires us to know what's going on with the startups that we work with. And so I spend about 20% of my time directly coaching startups that we work with at Embark Collective, in addition to my day job as a CEO. And so I sort of, I built that into my job description because that's where I get a lot of passion. And every team member at Embark Collective does the same thing. We're really engaged, and I actually have never seen a startup support organization as engaged in the day-to-day of the companies that we work with as I have seen at Embark Collective. And that's not to toot my own horn, it's just to tell you my own observation.
Absolutely.
And so it's about knowing who we need to serve, and then knowing how we can serve them. And so that's pulling the right levers within our network. And you don't place every ask you can to your network. There's things that you reserve for the big asks. There's the folks that on your network that you can ask a little favor of, and they'll say like, yes, absolutely, no questions asked. And so really understanding how to best leverage your network so that you're not burning bridges, but you're really adding value to the people that you're serving ultimately.
How important is it for the founder to really build out their own personal brand? You look at someone like Elon Musk, incredible personal brand. There's a lot of other startups out there that have founders that are very active online and building their own audience because they're just sharing their passion of solving whatever problems there are in the world through their companies. How important and how much do you guys encourage founders to have a personal brand, but really just to build a reputation and build a community around them, their passion for these ideas and passions for solving problems?
Great question. And I don't know if I have fully formulated my perspective on this. I think as an early stage founder, your personal brand and the brand of the organization are so intertwined. And so I think it's really important to understand that every action you do represents the company and vice versa. And so there's a lot around building personal brands. And I do think that there's a lot of value to having a strong point of view, having a voice, being active on social media so they can be reached. I mean, that's how you and I were connected. It was through social media. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities that can come your way by engaging. But I'm definitely not the person that's running around saying, build your personal brand, and that's it, at the detriment of everything else.
How do you inspire your customers, your employees to this mission that you want? A lot of people say that, you're going to be the one that cares the most about it. But when you think about building an audience, you actually need people to care for this problem and the solution probably as much, if not more than you, because they're the ones that are going to really broadcast your message and broadcast your solutions and products. So how do you get people inspired and connected with your product and startup?
I think it's two things. It's relevance and it's repetition. So from a relevance standpoint, the way that each person's going to connect with your value proposition may slightly be different based on who they are. And, if you went from like an audience mapping standpoint, what type of audience are they to you? And so I think you've got to understand that your product doesn't have a singular meaning for every type of audience that you're serving, and you've got to figure out the way to make it the most relevant to you. There's multiple dimensions of the Embark Collective value proposition, and certain dimensions are really important to certain types of founders, where other dimensions are important to other founders. The other piece is repetition, which is something that I have learned from a board member of mine, who I talk to regularly around just my own leadership development. And he really reinforces the fact that he has a couple of messages that he just makes sure that anytime he is speaking to his team, he makes a point to reinforce. And it really just becomes that chant that the team continually hears. And then, as a team member, you start to internalize it after a while. It takes a long time for somebody to really internalize a message, but if you hear it enough, you start to internalize it and really make it yours. So I think that key to relevance and then repetition, just keep repeating the message every time you have the opportunity. I try to make sure that I share the mission, which is the mission of Embark Collective, is to help Tampa-based startup talent build bold, thriving, scalable companies, and making sure that people know that's what we're about. We're an education nonprofit that does that, and we care about helping the people who are building these ambitious companies, and using every opportunity you get to be able to reinforce that chant so that people can understand it, hear it, understand it, and make it theirs.
I finish off the podcast with a segment called Open Mic. This is a chance for my guests to share anything they want. A lot of times, I feel like people get stuck behind the industry that they are in, but we are all human and have other interests outside of that. So this is a space for my guests to say whatever they want to say.
Well, I think that in 2020, which has been what a year, 2020, and I talked earlier about how there's just so many problems that we are experiencing as a society that are just so at the forefront of everyone's mind right now. And so I just think that there's an opportunity for all of us to think about, how can we be agents of change? And that doesn't need to be around entrepreneurship. But I do believe that everyone has this power to be an activist. And I'm, without telling you what to be an activist about, whether I don't care about your point of view, I don't care about what is your cause, but I do think that everyone has this ability when we see so many problems, let's all try to find ways to be part of the solution, whether it's whether it's I'm trying to think of different ways that I talk with my team about, but at a minimum, it's like vote. Make sure you can vote. Like that's an easy one that people can do. But we have a voice, we have power. And understanding that realizing like you do have a voice and you do have power. You have social media, you have the power to vote, you have the power to donate, you have the power to protest. You can do whatever you want, but make sure you're utilizing that power, because that's just an amazing gift. And in a time where we're seeing so many crises sort of come to the forefront, for us to find some positive outcomes from it all requires some action by all of us. So that's what's been on my mind is like, how do we use our power for good to make the society that we all individually want to create for ourselves.
My key takeaway from this conversation with Lakshmi is how important talking to your audience members about what they want. If you want an audience, you are in the business of serving others and listening. Many don't serve or listen, and their audience suffers or never comes to fruition. To build a great audience around your business, you need to talk with the people around you. You can follow Lakshmi on Twitter at @Shenoy and visit Embark Collective's website at embarkcollective.com. All the links to find Lakshmi and Embark Collective will be in the show notes. Thank you, Lakshmi, for being on the show. If you like this show, tweet me at Matthew Gutozzi. And if you really love this show, drop a rating on Apple Podcasts or your podcast listening app, and I will talk to you next week.